Hello, thank you for tuning into Desert Euphonies. This is Joel. Today we're doing episode 3, How Islam Transformed the Jewish World. Now, originally I was going to do a pretty thorough survey of the Jewish world in the first couple of centuries of Islam, but it just proved to be far too large a topic. My rough draft got up to 5,000 words, and I wasn't even a third of the way through the content that I wanted to cover. So today, what I'm going to do is just present a pretty high-level general survey of how Islam changed the Jewish world for the first couple of centuries, basically looking at the Abbasid, Fatimid, and Umayyad caliphates in very general detail. I'm going to be leaving a lot of things out. There's going to be a lot of exceptions to most of what I say in this video, but just keep in mind that this is a very basic general overview of what Jewish life was like during that period of time. So the world that Islam inherits immediately after the conquest is one that is divided not ethnically or ideologically, but along faith lines. The various religions like Judaism and Christianity acted much more like national communities than as the religion of private personal practice we know today. And the communities were divided by well-defined walls and barriers. While in the 3rd century CE, it was not uncommon to find churches presided over by a rabbi, by the 6th century things had become much more stark. Christian theologians and Jewish religious scholars worked hard to define each tradition as clearly separate, and their congregations followed distinct systems of belief, ritual, and even law, as Jewish and Christian communities maintained their own separate court systems. The social safety net which supported you was also separated along confessional lines. Jews and Christians would have their own separate schools, hospitals, houses for the poor, and so on, which were funded by taxes paid by specific congregations to their respective religious authorities which administered them. Daily life was also heavily segregated by religion, as a series of laws passed in Christendom increasingly forbade Christians from feasting or working with Jews, and religious authorities on both sides strongly discouraged intermarriage. Lines of patronage were also divided within religious communities. In Sassanid Persia, the state religion Zoroastrianism experienced a wave of religious intolerance in the 5th and 6th centuries as well, which caused them to draw very significant boundaries between themselves and the Christian and Jewish minorities within their realm. So the world that Islam conquers is one in which the different religious communities more or less supported, defined, and governed themselves. Because the Arab Muslim conquerors were in the minority and ruled from small military bases outside the major cities and towns, they simply didn't have the manpower to begin to micromanage the affairs of the various religious minorities under their control, and allowed them to work as their own societies, maintaining the system of religious autonomy which existed prior to their arrival. Before the Islamic conquests, Jewish power, prestige, and status was rather uneven. For example, in the city of Medina, they achieved the highest levels of political power, while in Visigothic Spain, a number of very harsh and draconian laws were passed against the Jews as a despised minority. When Islam arrives on the scene, it flattens the legal status of all non-Muslim monotheists by giving them the single legal status of dhimmi. This referred to a protected person, one who was not required to fight as a soldier in the wars that spread early Islam, provided they pay the jizya. Now, the jizya was a poll tax applied on religious minorities, which was adopted from the previous Persian system. A lot of people tend to look at dhimmi status in a pretty simplistic way, basically seeing it as something parallel to the color line that existed in the American South during Jim Crow or in apartheid South Africa, in which Africans were forced to deal with legal disabilities, economic barriers, social barriers, and extreme subordination that guaranteed that in all instances, people of African descent were lesser than people of European descent. And this is simply not the case when you look at what it actually meant to be a dhimmi in the day-to-day life of Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians in the early Islamic societies. Now, I don't want to wade too deeply into Islamic theology and the view of other non-Muslim monotheists. However, Islam extended a basic toleration, respect, and legitimacy to the other monotheistic religions. As far as Islam was concerned, given that these minorities believed in one God, had a sacred scripture, and believed in a day of judgment, they fit into the sense of social contract within Islam. It was basically like Hobbes' Leviathan. Hobbes said that we all need to trust in the power of a single sovereign and believe that they have the ability to punish people who commit wrongdoing and criminal action in society. Islam basically had a kind of supernatural view that mirrored that. So while it had a very, very, very low sense of tolerance for pagan monotheists, other monotheists met the basic requirements of being included in the community that Islam was building. Religious minorities generally had their lives and property protected, and they also prospered a great deal, rather than it being simply a case of the color line between blacks and whites, in which blacks are underprivileged and abused in all areas. Christians and Jews routinely held high positions in the state bureaucracy of the Islamic caliphates. Their merchants often achieved a staggering wealth beyond what most Muslims would see in their lifetimes. And at work, in recreation, and in their social life, it was not very segregated. They intermixed mostly as equals in their day-to-day lives. For all practical intents and purposes, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians lived equal lives in common, with a few caveats that I'll discuss shortly in the video. Prior to the Islamic conquests, the Jewish world was divided between three major communities in Babylonia, Palestine, and Egypt, and these were governed by separate imperial powers, the Persians and the Byzantines. And the fact that crossing these borders required crossing imperial boundaries really put a lot of barriers between the movement of people, goods, and ideas. For example, if you wanted to, let's say, go from the great academies of Babylonia and work in the great academies of Palestine or Egypt, you would be required to pay additional customs duties, and in some cases you would even have to pay your income tax for the year a second time to the society that you're traveling towards. Also, sometimes there were arbitrary barriers placed on Jewish migration. For example, the Byzantine Christians barred Jews from migrating to Jerusalem simply because they had a built-in theological anti-Semitism and didn't want to see much prosperity in the Jewish community of Jerusalem. There were also significant linguistic barriers. Jews were speaking Farsi, Aramaic, Greek, Arabic, and a number of other languages, which prevented a common cultural and religious dialogue. This was particularly troubling for the Jewish community, which for the last 1,000 years had defined itself by its religious coherence. Now, the Islamic conquest tore down these borders and, in so doing, restored unity to the vivisected Jewish world. The lack of national and international borders allowed Jews to move freely from the Spanish Atlantic coast to the eastern edge of Afghanistan without having to worry about any kind of additional tax or customs duties, and being reassured by a single legal status which protected them under the law regardless of where they traveled to. With this came increased freedom of movement for merchants and religious scholars, allowing both to prosper greatly. For example, it's during this period of time that we're able to see Jews who are religious scholars in Babylonia take up positions in Egypt and vice versa, which really allowed for a cross-pollination of ideas and beliefs. It also allowed Jews from the periphery in places like Visigothic Spain to travel to the Jewish center and vice versa. Linguistic barriers also fell away as Arabic, or a variant known as Judeo-Arabic, became the lingua franca of the Islamic world. When combined with the Arab obsession with paper, which was far more versatile than the material they were using for scrolls previously, as well as the highly efficient Arab postal service, documents were now able to travel cheaply, reliably, and frequently from the core of the Jewish world to the periphery. As geographic and linguistic borders were erased, barriers between the various cultures of the Western world were lowered to a great degree as well. While each faith community demanded that their distinctiveness continue to be respected, the Muslim Arabs proved very adept at facilitating a dialogue within the diversity, and a free flow of religious ideas, religious and secular, allowed Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians to enter a common cultural conversation. An example of one of the spaces where these conversations frequently took place were the salons that dotted the Islamic landscape. These were places where people of all faiths could gather together freely and openly, listen to poetry, or hear debates on the hot-button issues of the day, and intermix with new ideas, as well as opening up pathways for friendship and connection, which did not exist previously before Islam lowered these sorts of boundaries, allowing the Jews to enter a wider cultural conversation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, quite often being in the dhimmi legal status was not simply a curse that brought on disadvantages. However, sometimes it did single out Jews, Christians, and Muslims for a pretty significant mistreatment. However, sometimes even these actions worked for the long-term gain of the Jewish people. An example of this was the Kharaj, which was a tax on non-Muslims owning farmland. At the time, the Jews were primarily rural, but the tax on the farmland, which was applied to the communities as a whole, eventually pushed the Jews off the farmland and pulled them into the city centers. Now, in the beginning, these Jews entered the lowest rungs of the urban economies, but over time they climbed the social ladder to become wealthy merchants and bankers, as well as valued specialists like doctors. Now, obviously, this does not justify targeting a population with specific taxes, but it does demonstrate the kind of give and take that marked Jewish life throughout the Islamic period. Another example of the mixed blessing to the Jews brought about by Islam was their status as stateless people, subject to repeated exiles and dispersions that scattered them across the world, from Germany to the edges of China. Now, this made them ideally situated as masters of the globalized trade network, particularly when tensions between the Christian and Islamic world ran hot enough that both societies closed their ports to each other's trade, and the Mediterranean basically shut down, except for Jews who were permitted to act as a neutral conduit for that trade. And in so doing, obviously, they achieved a great amount of prosperity. Another fascinating case of Jewish economic activity during this period of time was the Radhanites. These were an elite group of Jewish merchants who operated across the world, bringing goods from China to Europe and back again through the Islamic world. Now, they operated in the early medieval period, and you can imagine, in the 9th century, these merchants, in order to do their job, being fluent in languages as diverse as Arabic, Greek, and Farsi, but also Frankish and Mandarin. And knowing these languages 1300 years ago, which to me is pretty staggering, they were the valued middlemen between the Abbasid Caliphate and Tang Dynasty China when both were at the height of their splendor. The prosperity of Jewish trade also fueled a pretty significant social safety net for Jews in the Islamic caliphates. Keep in mind that each community taxed itself and provided for its own needs independently. So Jewish centers of learning, as well as the charitable foundations which ran schools, hospitals, poorhouses, and so on, relied upon these networks of Jewish trade and Jewish production. In some cases, they were able to use that to pretty significant levels. In Fatimid Egypt, Jewish charitable organizations were forced to provide food, clothing, and shelter, both for Jewish migrants following the collapse and breakup of Abbasid power, and the scores of refugees fleeing the Crusader ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and they proved that their charitable institutions were up to those tasks. Jewish religious development also reached new heights while being transformed in the Islamic world. The erasure of borders, as I mentioned previously, allowed talent and donations from around the Jewish diaspora to flood the Jewish academies in the core of Babylonia, Palestine, and Egypt. In return, these Jewish academies were able to send their advice and teaching, a kind of literature known as responsa literature, to the far-flung Jewish diaspora, cheaply, reliably, and in a common tongue. This meant that Jews across the Islamic world now had access to in-depth Jewish education, and a common Jewish practice was allowed to develop. Albeit there were different strains of Judaism, such as Karaite Judaism or Rabbinic Judaism, but these could now be found equally across the Jewish landscape. The fact that Jews, Christians, and Muslims were now able to participate in a common conversation meant that as one religion became interested in a particular topic or area of development, the other religions became equally interested in those areas. For example, Muslim scholars began the study of linguistics in order to preserve the original meanings of the Quran. Jewish scholars, looking at this effort, began an equal linguistic analysis of their own holy scriptures, often working directly alongside Christian and Muslim linguists in the same rooms in order to preserve their holy text meanings and make it intelligible to non Jews. This linguistic study also extended into the invention of new forms of written Hebrew, such as the invention of cantillons, which are accent marks in the Torah which show the melody with which it ought to be sung. In addition to this linguistic focus, Jews picked up the Islamic fascination with Greek philosophy. The Muslim rulers in the Abbasid period became dedicated to the translation of Greek texts, particularly the work of Aristotle. And so their scholars began looking for ways to ground their religion in reason, not simply in revelation. And Jewish scholars began to do the same as the study of religious philosophy became an emphasis in Jewish religious schools. There was also a transformation in how everyday Jews began to approach their religion and their religious authorities, which mirrored the approach of everyday Muslims. In Islam, there were the four schools of Islamic law, of Sharia law, and often everyday Muslims seeking a particular arbitration would send a letter describing the situation to members of each of the four schools. They would pore over the various advices they were given, choose the one which was most satisfactory to their needs, and then offer the school that gave the best answer a significant donation. And while each of the different Jewish religious sects attempted to convert the Jewish masses to a loyalty exclusively to their own point of view, everyday Jews approached their religious schools in the same way. When they had a particular need for arbitration or requested recognition or were support in other ways, they would write letters to each of the major Jewish schools. The one which gave the best answer would receive a donation. But when another issue appeared in the life of that Jew or Jewish community, they would repeat the process of soliciting the various Jewish schools and rewarding the one which gave the most satisfactory answer. As I said, the Jewish community functioned more or less as its own self-governing, autonomous community within the larger framework of Islamic society. They ran their own charities and courts and ran them by their own rules, by staff that came primarily from the religious authorities. Quite often, these were in the hands of the religious authorities, but often as well, they were in the hands of secular authorities who were recommended by religious scholars and approved by the caliphs. The most famous of the secular authorities were the exilarchs. These were members of the House of David who were given control over issues from taxation to the courts, as well as representing Jewish concerns to the caliph or local Muslim rulers. You see, the Islamic government worked on what was called a petition response system, in which they let society run itself until a subject, either Muslim or non-Muslim, petitioned the local Muslim rulers to address a particular situation, at which point the Muslim rulers would respond with a particular advice or direction, thus settling the matter. Now, in theory, anyone was free to approach the government with a grievance. But in reality, if you wanted to be heard, and if you wanted the issue to be resolved to your satisfaction, it was required to have an advocate, a well-placed Jewish merchant or religious scholar, or someone respected by the Muslim government to advocate on your behalf. Now, what could happen from time to time would be that the Jewish religious authorities and the secular authority would come to loggerheads, and Jewish political activity would reach a point of paralysis. In those cases, the Caliph themselves had to enter the situation and resolve the issue. This was very useful from the perspective of royal propaganda because it meant that the Caliph was always able to intervene as the wise and calm patron who can step in a fatherly fashion to resolve disputes. And quite often, the Caliphs were adept at reaching resolution to problems within the Jewish community. But it also had the effect of letting Jews know that at the end of the day, the people in charge of their community wasn't the religious authorities or the exarch, but the Muslim ruler. At the end of the day, their lives are not their own, but determined by the outside Muslim community. Now, there is a common expression that Islam was spread by the sword. And in a sense, that is true. The Muslim Arabs built their empire in the same way anyone else has ever built an empire. But the saying is also often meant to imply that Islam achieved mass conversions of other monotheists at the point of a sword. And to be honest, that is simply not true. While it is true that physical violence was used against pagan Arabs to make them convert, early Islamic society did not do the same to other monotheists. As a matter of fact, Islam's first dynasty, the Umayyads, went out of their way to proactively discourage non-Arabs from joining their new religion. When forced conversions did occur, these were aberrations, and you can see this both in the rarity of forced conversions, as well as the disagreeable attitude that wider Islamic society took toward these forced conversions. For example, the religiously tolerant society of Islamic Spain was for a time taken over by extremists who did force Jews to convert, and many did, or at least pretended to, for no other reason than to save their life. However, when Jews escaped Spain for the Islamic territory of Fatimid Egypt, they were permitted to immediately resume their lives as Torah-observant Jews. That said, the ultimate goal of Islamic society was to see the conversion of its Jewish subjects, individually and collectively, and they were quite determined to use every peaceful means at their disposal to make use of their monopoly on power to make the Jews convert. For example, Jews who converted to Islam were encouraged to write polemics explaining what they saw as the errors within the Jewish tradition. Jews were forbidden from meeting those polemics head on and addressing those arguments point by point to defend themselves. There was also a steady drain on Jewish families. Any Jew who married a Muslim was expected to convert, but no Muslim who married a Jew was expected to convert to Judaism. In this way, weddings could often be times of great celebration for Muslims, but bittersweet for the Jews who had lost another member of their kin to the mainstream religion. Perhaps the most powerful carrot that Islam had to entice Jews to convert, however, was the system of patronage and political power which combined business, politics, and religion. A Jew who converted to Islam would always have an edge over Jews who remained Jewish because they were now included not only as business partners with a Muslim, but as family as well. And as Jews who are at the top of their local hierarchies converted to Islam, it put a great deal of pressure on Jews beneath them to convert as well. In this way, it was not uncommon to see Jewish businesses and Jewish communities convert entirely to Islam over the course of several decades. So, being Jewish in the early Islamic world put you in a pretty strange place. On the one hand, you are permitted to go about your life peacefully at a time when Jewish civilization and culture is prospering, at a time that it never had been before. The upper ranks of political and business power are as open to you in everyday practice as they're open to any other Muslim, but society is still doing its best to assimilate you into itself and to cause the eventual extinction of your community as a recognizable community. All right, so there you have a brief summary of Jewish life in early Islam. It's a very bird's eye view perspective, but I wanted to set the general sense and boundaries of what it meant to be a Jew at the time. In subsequent videos, I'd like to do a bit more of a deeper dive into Jewish life in Baghdad, Egypt, and Spain. Certainly an interesting topic. As well, in my first video, I know I promised a video on the contest between the exilarchs and the religious scholars in the Abbasid Caliphate. That is also a really interesting topic that I'll get down to down the road as well. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.